All right, so let's go on a journey through respiratory function and starting with kind of what we're doing when we breathe in. And first off, let's talk about what step in the whole process that is. So when we're breathing, that's pulmonary ventilation. So with pulmonary ventilation, what you're doing is you're changing the space in your lungs. You're changing the thoracic cavity, which will then move the lungs. And then based on that, you're going to get a difference in pressures. So if we are doing an inhale, actually just do an inhale real quick. I think you'll know the answer to this. We make the space bigger. So with an inhale, we're increasing the volume, which then decreases the pressure, because pressure is just the concentration of the molecules in that space. And so if we make that space bigger, the molecules have more room in between them. And the molecules out here in the atmosphere will see that extra space and they'll be drawn in. So air then gets drawn in. Okay, so after we draw that air in, actually before we go there, how did we do that? So we all did it, right? So if we're consciously deciding to increase that volume, what you're using is skeletal muscles. We should probably talk about those muscles first. So let's talk about the muscles. The primary inspiratory muscles. These are the diaphragm and the external intercostal. So the external does inhalation. Talk later about the internals doing exhalation. So X does in and in does X, if you think of them backwards. So we have the diaphragm and the external intercostals. We also have accessory inspiratory muscles. And what we mean by that is these are used in forced breathing. So this is quiet breathing or resting breathing. And then this is forced. This is the extra big breath. And so when we're doing the extra big breath, we're going to use things like the sternocleidomastoid, because we're lifting up from the top, pectoralis minor. And also when you do that big breath, you arch your back a little bit. So we're also going to use what we call the erector spinae muscles. And so those make the space bigger, drawing that air in. So now going back to the next question, what do we do once we get that air in? Well, the whole point, right, on the inhale is that we want to drop off carbon dioxide and pick up oxygen. Well, what are we picking it up through? And so this is our next step, which is external respiration. With external respiration, you have a respiratory membrane. A respiratory membrane has three parts. You have your type 1 alveolar cell, which is just simple squamous epithelium. You have a fused basement membrane, and you have another simple squamous cell on the other side. This one's your endothelium. It's called endothelium because on the other side of this is blood, and over here is the external environment. When you take that inhale, the air that gets all the way down to the alveoli, that's still outside of your body because it hasn't crossed the membrane yet. So in that external environment, you're going to have a high, we call partial pressure of oxygen. And inside of the blood is going to be low partial pressure of oxygen. And so what we're going to do, just like always, is molecules are going to go down their concentration gradients. So that oxygen is going to go into the blood from that space in the alveolus. Oh, and just as a refresher, the endothelium, also simple squamous epithelium. Okay, so now we have it in. What do we do next? Well, we got to transport it. So our next step is transport. With that transportation of an oxygen molecule, we're going to take that oxygen you can diffuse in the plasma. Not oxygen's favorite way to travel. Most of it will bind to the iron in hemoglobin. And that, if you remember, is the protein inside of a red blood cell that holds gases. All right, so then we're going to travel. So remember, this right here, the external respiration, that's the exchange between the lungs and the blood. We have to go back to the heart and then get pumped from the heart back out to the tissues that you want to deliver that oxygen to. So now we are going to do internal respiration. Respiration here is when we're crossing membranes. Ooh, that is a squeaky marker. With internal respiration, we're doing the same thing. We're crossing an endothelium. There's a basement membrane. And then there's a tissue on the other side. This cell can be a variety of different things, depending on the tissue you're going to. So we'll just say tissue cell. When you're moving here, that tissue is being active. And so it's probably low in O2. But out here, you're high in partial pressure of oxygen because you filled up that, oh, where are we at? That hemoglobin. So high concentration to low concentration. So we're going into that cell. So why are we doing that? We're doing that so the next thing that we can do is cellular respiration. Oh, squeaky marker. What we're trying to do with cellular respiration is provide our body with energy. And to do that, we're going to break down glucose. This is our preferred way. We could break down other things, but let's stick with glucose. So we're going to break down glucose. So we have C6H12O6, that's glucose. And we need oxygen, specifically 6 of them, to help release energy. To break down the sugar, we need oxygen to break it down fully. And when we break down the sugar, the energy stored in these bonds gets released. And so what we're going to do is we're going to say energy here. It gets released. And then what we're going to do with it is charge up our storage, which is ADP. We're going to stick a phosphate on there to make ATP. And that's our body's preferred, I think of it like a charge battery. That's our body's preferred energy source. We use the energy freed up by doing cellular respiration to charge up the ATP. When you do that, as a byproduct, we make CO2 and water. And now we got to take that CO2 and get it out, right? I think a lot of us are familiar with that idea. So now we got to do something with that CO2. So what are we going to do here? Well, we have a membrane that we just talked about on this side, right? So we have on this side's the blood. Over here is our tissue. So here's the cell that made our CO2. We're going to take that CO2 and we're going to stick it into our blood, going back through that tissue cell, the basement membrane, and the endothelium. Now we're in blood. Now we have to transport it. So if we're keeping track here, we just did internal respiration. So I guess we'll go like this. So we did internal respiration. Now we're going to do transport. With transport, CO2 could also diffuse. Not its favorite way. It could also bind onto hemoglobin, but not the iron. The iron's the assigned seat for oxygen. So what we're going to do is bind amino acids on hemoglobin, which makes something called carbaminohemoglobin. But our favorite way? The number one way that we move CO2 is doing a chemical reaction with the same byproduct that we just made. So what we could do is take CO2, stick it to water. This works inside of a red blood cell because there's an enzyme to do this. This is carbonic anhydrase. That will make H2CO3, which is carbonic acid. If you have an acid, it's called an acid because it will release a hydrogen ion. And anything on this side of the arrow, right here, has to still be on that side. So the rest of that molecule carries over, but this has the plus, so that means this has the minus. This is bicarbonate ion. So we have hydrogen ion, bicarbonate ion. We will trade out, because this is happening inside the red blood cell. We're going to make a trade, and we're going to swap that bicarb for chloride and do something we call a chloride shift. So our cell can carry the chloride instead of the bicarbonate ion. But here's what's really useful about that. Bicarbonate ion is a great buffer. So we've made a buffer that our body can use to help neutralize our extra floating hydrogen ions if there are some out there. Okay, so when we get back to the lungs, we can reverse this chemical reaction. All chemical reactions are reversible. And we are going to travel through that membrane. So if you remember, we have our external environment, and then we have our blood. And over here, we have a high concentration. So high partial pressure of CO2. And then in the external environment, it's low. So low partial pressure of CO2. And so we'll diffuse back across the membrane that way. Okay, so now we've done our external respiration. Now we got to exhale. So how do we do that? Well, if we want to do an exhale, we have to make the volume smaller. We got to do the opposite. So we're going to decrease volume, which squishes the molecules together and increases the pressure. That pushes air out. Well, how do we do that? So at rest, it's what we call passive. Just relax these muscles. So the diaphragm, when we used it, it's a dome-shaped muscle. It sits right on the bottom of the thoracic cavity. When we use it, it pushes down and it squishes the abdominal organs. And when it squishes the abdominal organs, When it relaxes, those abdominal organs are going to push right back up. They want their space back. It's called abdominal recoil. And we relax the external intercostals, the ribs will fall back down. Again, recoil, we have elastic fibers, but also gravity. So we'll relax those. That makes the space smaller because you go back to your original size, pushing air out. But what if you want to do a forced exhale? So do a big forced exhale real quick. Pushing that air out, you curled forward. We used our abdominal muscles. And as we mentioned before, we're going to use an intercostal, but instead of the one that pulls up this way, we're going to use the one that comes down this way. So we're going to use the internal ones. So forced exhale, we're going to use the internal intercostals and abdominal muscles. And that will push that CO2 out. And that's basically the whole cycle, right? We bring in oxygen by changing the volume, using those skeletal muscles. We cross that membrane into our blood. We transport most of it on the hemoglobin. We go across the membrane at a tissue, do some cellular respiration, make CO2. CO2 is going to cross that membrane at the tissue, going into blood. We can transport it, but most of the time we'll do it, well, we are transporting, but most of the time the favorite way to transport is doing the chemical reaction. We get back up towards the lungs, we reverse that chemical reaction, CO2 goes across the membrane, we change the volume to push the CO2 out. And that's what we do when we're dealing with the respiratory system. Thanks for watching.